Good afternoon. I'm Halie Soifer, CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and I want to thank everyone for joining today's conversation. But first, I want to thank everyone for being a part of this movement, whether it was canvassing or phone banking across battleground states, convening virtually and in person nearly every day since the beginning of August. We did incredibly important work in this election, and we're all incredibly proud of it. And we have a lot more work to do together. Our goal in this election was to ensure that Jewish voters continue to support Democrats who share our values. And that largely occurred thanks to our efforts. Sadly, it wasn't enough to be decisive in the presidential election, but we find some comfort knowing that Jewish voters stood strong with Democrats and Kamala Harris, thanks to our work. At this difficult crossroads, we find comfort in our community, this community that we have built together, which we will continue to build as a political home for all Jewish voters whose views and values will not be represented by a Trump White House. And our work will be even more important in the months and years ahead. We're not going anywhere, and neither should you. JDCA was created at a moment just like this one, at the beginning of the Trump administration. At the time, there was no national organization representing Jewish and Democratic voters. And in the immediate aftermath of neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville and a president who equated them with peaceful protesters, JDCA emerged to counter Donald Trump's policies, agenda, and efforts. And over the course of the next 4 elections, we got to work, growing the scope and size of our efforts each year and achieving important milestones and election wins, thanks to each of you. And in this election, we accomplished more than ever before. Together, we made 2.8 million direct voter contacts. We knocked on nearly 53,000 doors in key states. We received more than 53 million views on our ads, and our 46 campus fellows made 1.6 million direct voter contacts just among younger voters. We had more than 65,000 of you join us for in-person and virtual programs, and we raised and spent more than ever before on behalf of our 146 candidates. And we had some important wins. Alyssa Slacken in Michigan, Jackie Rosen in Nevada, Ruben Gallego in Arizona, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, who will be critically important voices for our values in the Senate. Along with House seats we defended and flipped thanks to Jewish voters, including Laura Gillen in New York 4, Josh Riley in New York 18, and Tom Suozzi in New York 3. We're proud of the fact that the Jewish vote represented one of the very few segments of the electorate where Donald Trump failed to make meaningful inroads. Together, we succeeded in ensuring that 71% of Jewish voters supported Kamala Harris nationally. And we'll talk more about that soon. But before we do, I want to say that while this moment is painful, we hope you join us in recommitting to the work. Whenever you're ready, we'll be here. And just to jumpstart that, we want to hear from you about how you want to engage with JDCA from this point forward. So please fill out our Defend Your Values form, which we'll put in the chat, so you can continue to take action with us in the future as we shift toward advocacy in the next few months and year ahead. With Donald Trump returning to the White House, our work is more important than ever before. And let's be clear, we're not backing down. We're not going to be silenced into submission. We will continue to serve as a political home and voice for Jewish voters. We are going to fight for what's right, and we will fight Donald Trump's agenda and fight for our values. But first, it's important for us to reflect on what happened in this election. And for that, I'm grateful to be joined by 2 of our friends and experts, Jim Gerstein and Simon Rosenberg. Jim is America's leading expert on Jewish voting patterns and a founding partner of GBAO Strategies, a public opinion research organization which polls for candidates and organizations, including JDCA. And Simon Rosenberg has spent 3 decades in national media and politics, including 2 presidential campaigns, and he leads the Hopium Chronicles community. So I'll start the conversation with both Simon and Jim and encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We will try to get to as many as possible. So for both of you, I will ask essentially the same question to start, which is what happened? But Jim, just starting with you, if you could talk about the Jewish vote in this election, what happened with Jewish voters? And how does the polling that we're relying on and you have put forward, which JDCA sponsored in September and October, and J Street did in November with your firm, all of which is very consistent, how this might differ from some of the exit polls that are out there about Jewish voters and how we can decipher between all of the numbers that are out there.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting, Halie, and a huge thank you and acknowledgement to what Halie and Ron Klein have done with JDCA and what JDCA has done over these past 8 years. I think it is remarkable and in a very difficult environment, both before and after October 7th. The environments were difficult for different reasons, and we are facing a very well-funded opposition or other side that is spending and trying to play off of a lot of concerns that Jewish voters have in ways that are not helpful. And I just applaud everybody that's part of this community, and I'm very happy to work with you and be part of this community. So thank you. As we look at the Jewish vote and what happened with Jewish voters, the headline is that Kamala Harris received 71% of the Jewish vote to Donald Trump's 26%. That is based off of a national survey that we did of people who voted in the election. And in addition to that, we did a survey of 500 voters, Jewish voters who voted in the election in Pennsylvania, in which she did even better in that battleground state where the campaign was waged. Among Jewish voters, she got 75% to Trump's 23%. There's always this speculation of is this the year that the Jewish vote leaves the Democrats because they're so horrible on our issues or whatever the case may be. And year in and year out, it doesn't happen. And like I said, the biggest problem that Democrats have with Jewish voters is that there are not more of them. Because if there were, we would have very different outcomes. I'd like to briefly talk about what was behind that vote, and then turn it over to Simon for his insights. Why did Kamala Harris get 71%? What does it mean? It's really in line with the historical performance of Democratic candidates with Jewish voters. In 2012, Barack Obama got 70%. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got 70%. Biden peaked at 77% in 2016 in the context of a pandemic and a very unpopular Donald Trump. And it's now reverted back to 71%, which has been where we typically see the presidential vote. We also see congressional vote patterns very similar. So she performed at a level that was very consistent with previous Democratic candidates. She also did this in a very difficult setting. And I think it's quite remarkable how well she did in an environment in which Republicans were spending tens of millions of dollars, including paid television advertising at large levels, to play off of concerns that Jews had post-October 7th. I would say their execution was very poor in the quality of the messaging that they had, but also we see that it failed miserably. And in addition to the execution, why did it fail so badly? The biggest priorities facing Jewish voters, as they told us, were the future of democracy and abortion rights. That's what drove their vote in this election. That does not mean that they don't care about Israel. They do care about Israel, and their attachment to Israel was much closer, became much stronger, and their concerns over anti-Semitism grew post-October 7th. But in addition to defeating or performing very well amid a lot of advertising paid media against her, she also did very well in what was a could have been a different environment because of what happened post October 7th. But what Jewish voters said to and how they voted and what they said was that, yeah, we have a lot of these concerns and it's been a traumatic, hard year, but our political beliefs and values remain constant, and that we agree with the Democrats' values, in this case, in particular, Kamala Harris, who is more popular than actually the Democratic Party and Joe Biden among Jewish voters. But also, there's a strong hostility and opposition to Republicans and Donald Trump. They have unfavorable ratings in the 70s, which makes it impossible for them to make real gains with Jewish voters. And they're doing nothing to change their brand that would address the concerns that Jewish voters have about Donald Trump and the Republicans. So the shared values, the issue priorities that they share, and their opposition to the Republican Party itself are what largely drives the Jewish vote. Yeah. Now, what I would also say, and that's very consistent, and major events only serve to reinforce their beliefs and support for Democratic candidates. Now, the last thing I'll say is about the exit polls and the different data that we see out there. There, folks who on this call, I presume, follow this stuff very closely and have probably seen a few numbers floating around there. There's a 79% support among Jews for Harris in the media consortium polls. There's a Fox poll that has it at 66%. There's a very bizarre Orthodox Union poll out there in Pennsylvania that makes no sense. I think it's very important to understand the difference between a poll of Jewish voters and a poll of voters that has a little crosstab for those who say that their religion is Jewish. Those are not Jewish polls. They exclude about 20, the traditional exit polls exclude about 25% of the Jewish population because of the way they do their screening. They exclude people who say that they identify as Jewish, but Judaism, but when they're asked what's their religion, they don't say Judaism. They just say, but when they're followed up and they're asked, well, do you consider yourself Jewish? They say yes. And that's a very democratic block. So these exit polls often undercount these Jews who do not view their religion as Jewish, but they view themselves as Jewish. That's 25% of the Jewish population, very democratic. And so that is often skewing the result. But the other thing I'd say is a lot of these other polls don't put out their demographics or their transparency, and they don't ask things like denomination, so you can do an assessment of of whether it's a representative sample. So due to those factors, you'd get a lot of stuff out there that does not have a representative sample, that doesn't provide the transparency required for a poll to be publicly reported on. And I just suggest everybody to take exit polling with a grain of salt and look to polls that are done with the kind of methodological rigor that is required for a small population within the country, so that you can get an accurate representation of what they believe. So I'm going to pause there and turn it back to Halie and Simon.
Thank you, Jim. And I will also just add that JDCA did its own polling for the first time in September and again in October. And the numbers were very consistent, showing just over 7 out of 10 Jewish voters were going to support Kamala Harris and Democrats. And that is nationally what occurred. Simon, so over to you, hoping you can explain how you reconcile what we all saw in polling in that final week that showed Harris up by a small margin, but still up. And frankly, what so many of us saw at the doors, it appeared, and JDCA was out there canvassing. So many of you were out there with us. There was such excitement. There was such positivity. It felt like there was great momentum going into those final days. Was the polling wrong, or were we reading it incorrectly? And how did we miss the majority of the electorate's unwillingness or inability to see Kamala Harris as an agent of change?
Lots of questions there. And let me say, first of all, it's great to be back with all of you. And I realized I didn't brush my hair properly today. I apologize. It's been, that kind of last weekend or so. And Halie, it's been great hanging out with you and doing all this work together with your amazing team. Yeah, look, I think a couple things. And I have a lot more questions than I do answers right now, and I think we all do. And Jim, we talked to Jim yesterday, and I think one of the things he mentioned is that it's going to take a while for all of us to figure out what happened. And of course, there are lots of people coming out with half-baked hot takes, and in these early days. But I'm at Hopium, and in my own work, I'm going very slow. And in fact, this is, I think, almost the first presentation I've really given because I'm trying not to jump in before I really understand and commit to things that I don't know. So first of all, on polling, it's very important for everyone to realize that in the final week, Harris had her best week of polling of the campaign. She was over 270 in most of the battleground state polls. All of the major polling averages tipped towards her at the end, including Nate Silver and 538. The early vote was, we actually outperformed 2020 in the early vote in 5 out of the 8 states, if you include Nebraska. And the campaign, I was on a private briefing, some of you may have been on that, on the National Finance Council on Friday afternoon before the election, and they were very, very upbeat about what was about to happen. And they were telling all of us that, they were confident they were going to win, that the late vote was breaking their way. And that's not what happened in the election. And I think that, one thing we do know at this point is that the national margin is probably going to be about, when all the votes are counted, and it's probably another 10 million votes or so to get counted. California takes a long time. Trump is going to get probably 49.8, 49.9 to her 48.4 or 5. So it's going to be about a 1.4 lead for him, or victory for him, which is very small. This is not a landslide, not a blowout. It's a squeaker. The 3 battleground states, we will have lost Wisconsin by 9/10 of a point, Michigan by 1.4, and Pennsylvania by 1.9. So a 2-point swing in those 3 states, and she would have won. And the Senate is very close. We don't know what's going to happen in Pennsylvania, even though it's been called by the AP. There's still enough votes out there that Casey could win. It's not likely, but it's not impossible, given what happened with Fetterman's vote 2 years ago. And the House is still undecided and uncalled, and it's going to be very, very close. And so, essentially, he got about half the vote in the country, and the Senate is very evenly divided, and the House is very evenly divided. And in reality, even though it doesn't feel this way, this was a very close election in a very closely divided nation, and that Trump, had a very small victory. It is, however, to get into the place of reality, too, it's the best showing for a Republican presidential candidate in 20 years, and only the second time Republicans have won the national popular vote since 1988, right? And so it's no small thing. There was about a 5.8 shift from Biden's numbers to this election. And the question is, what happened, right? Haley, you asked that. What do we, I think that everyone's got opinions. And first of all, I'm waiting for the campaign to tell us what happened. And that hasn't happened yet. And I will be honest with you, I'm a little surprised that we haven't heard from Jen O'Malley Dillon and David Plouffe and the senior team to tell us what they think happened. And that needs to happen soon, I think, for all of our understandings. I do think that my initial takeaways, and I don't have many at this point, is one, we failed to disqualify him. It just didn't happen. I mean, we didn't disqualify him. He can't, he was able to rise above. And remember, the fear and opposition to MAGA had driven the 2018, 2020, 2022, and 23 elections across the country. So there was probably no more baked in sentiment into the electorate than that something had gone wrong with the Republican Party, because tens of millions of people had voted against that repeatedly in elections. I think the campaign and Future Forward, which spent $700 million and didn't really attempt to disqualify him. I think one of the big questions we all have to get to know and understand is, how in the world did the super PAC, which traditionally super PACs often do the negative hit, right, and let the campaign tell their own story. Our super PAC didn't go after Trump. Their ads went up very late, starting in August. I think Future Forward was a failure, a $700 million failure, and is something that we all are going to have to come to better understand. Second is that, I do think, and I should have said this at the very beginning, I think the vice president was given a very tough assignment. I think that she took over the campaign on July 21st. She was not terribly well known nationally. She had to take over a campaign that was built for somebody else, pull the party together, pick a VP, run the convention, build a national story and narrative, have that debate, right? And think about that. From the time she got into the first debate, that debate with Trump, that was 6 weeks. And she pulled it off. And I still think her performance and the way that she conducted herself and the way that she ran around the country doing her events was amazing. And she performed at an extraordinary level in a very tough assignment. And I do think there's a lot of thinking that she needed a little bit more time to really introduce herself, that she still, despite all the money and everything else, she didn't have enough time to convince people that she was okay and that she was a viable alternative to Trump. But I think we all have to recognize that I think one of the reasons that she considered herself an underdog, and I'll wrap up here, Haley, is that she thought that taking this on July 21st, given how little known she was and given how little profile, frankly, she had during the Biden years, was always going to be really hard against a guy who was unbelievably well known and who was, at least, because we didn't disqualify him, was at least the devil they know, right? On some levels, right? Because we didn't remind everybody about effectively what a danger he was. And so when I look at what just happened, I think two final points. One is she did an extraordinary job. And I think we can distinguish between what she did and what the campaign did. And I think it's going to be important to do that going forward. The second thing is it's really important to recognize that in all these battleground states, I mean, look at what we did, right? We won in the Senate race in Nevada, we won it in Arizona, we won it in Michigan and Wisconsin. We may win Pennsylvania, we still don't know yet. We won the governorship in North Carolina and won some other statewide races there and broke their supermajority. This was not a repudiation of the Democratic Party, right? This was a Democrats down ballot in these same states had some really consequential wins. And I think we have to take comfort in that. I mean, things could have been far worse than they were. I mean, we could have lost all those Senate races. And so all that work that we've done, all the money that we raised, all the volunteering, we won these Senate races by 20, 30,000 votes, one of them by 70,000. The margins in these places are so small that it meant that everything that we did together really mattered. And I think that one of the things that I'm really focused on is there needs to be a big discussion in the family, led by the new DNC head, whoever that is, about why it is he was able to do so well without running as many ads and doing as much groundwork as we did. And given the enormity of our effort, what do we take away from that, right? How do we learn from that? How do we understand? Many of you spend an enormous amount of money. And, what did we get for that? How did he beat us with a third of the amount of ads that he had up in the air? These are really important questions for us to be airing out together so that all of us have confidence that the work that we do and the money that we give actually is going to places that really make a difference. And that it's not just, we're not just lighting stuff on fire. And that's going to be important for Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and the new leaders of the party to really have this dialogue with all of us and to explain to us what they think happened, right? So that we have a greater confidence that when we go give the money again and we do the work again, it's vital work as opposed to make work, right? Or, we're making a bunch of fundraisers happy as opposed to actually winning elections. And so I think that's going to be another piece of all this. I want to say one last thing, Haley, if I can, is that I think the next 2 years is going to be really, really hard. And everyone has to steady themselves and get ready for that and figure out ways that you're going to stay in the game. And given the difficulty of what's likely to happen. And I am the hopium guy, but I also am a pragmatist that I think that with Trump, it's always the worst case, right? And we shouldn't, we just have to be ready for living with him dominating the news for the next 2 years and what that's going to mean for all of us every day when we get up. And he is the president of the United States in a much stronger position than he was 8 years ago, with control of the House and the Senate. It's going to be really hard, and we need to be prepared for that. So that, on a not very hopium level note, Halie, I'll turn it back to you.
And we are preparing, I should say, are preparing. I recommend walks and turning off the news every once in a while, but we are preparing here. Jim, picking up on something that Simon mentioned, specifically the Senate wins in Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin, where the Democratic Senate candidates prevailed with a larger share of the vote than Harris. How did they do this? How was it that a select group of our Senate incumbents, and in one case, Alyssa Slotkin, an open seat, how did they win against what appeared to be political headwinds, very difficult political headwinds this cycle against Democrats? Were there split ticket voters? What lessons can be learned from those Senate wins?
Sure. And I would highlight, to begin these comments, I would say that we should recognize in 2012 and in 2016, there was only one instance where a state voted for the president of one party, for one party for president and for a different party for the Senate. It only happened once in the previous 2 elections. We had it happen 4 times in this election. As Simon mentioned, there's still counting votes in Pennsylvania as well. I think that the reason that we saw these candidates outperform the top of the ticket and by enough to eke out these victories, as well as Senate candidates even in states where we lost both. But why did Senate candidates in these states in particular were they able to outperform? There's some unique, each one has its own uniqueness, but at the core of it is, I believe that they were able to separate themselves from the Biden administration and have their own separate identity, specifically on issues related to immigration and the border. Alyssa Slotkin, this is a big piece of her campaign. Jackie Rosen's, Ruben Gallego as well. I mean, these were very, they had the ability to not really, that they had the advantage that Kamala Harris didn't have, which is they weren't part of the administration that was, with a president who had a 41% job approval, historical low for this at this point in a campaign. And they were able just to distinguish themselves just enough. The other piece of it, and Simon talked a lot, about the super PACs and the role of super PACs in defining the opponent. In these Senate races, the super PACs were very effective at defining the Republican opponent on abortion rights. And for in the data that we had prior to the election, and Simon is 100% right that it's way too early to really know what happened, because there's a lot of data crunching that needs to happen. A lot of the voter files have to get updated. I understand the big desire out there to make sense of all of this and how could people, it's very painful to see how Trump conducted himself in the last 2 weeks of the election when we were tied and these big deciders broke for him. Even after watching this, it can be very painful. But as based on the data and everything we know throughout the election, where these Senate candidates outperformed the top of the ticket was particularly with independent women. There were other groups, but as well, including Black voters and Hispanic voters. But independent women were a centerpiece of where they were outperforming the top of the ticket. And they were particularly motivated and moved when the Republican Senate candidate was defined as opposing abortion rights and being supportive of overturning Roe versus Wade. So I think those two things, the ability separate themselves from the administration and have their own identity in a way that a sitting vice president is inherently hampered and unable to do, and or limited in how much they can do. So that separation, but also the ability to define their candidate and hold them to account on abortion rights was enough in these states to put them over the top. The other thing I would say is each race is unique. Carrie Lake is not a good candidate for Senate. Still a tough race, a race in which we lost the presidency, but I believe it's at 5 points right now. But Gallego was able to outperform even more so because the uniqueness of how bad Carrie Lake was. In Pennsylvania, the Republican candidate McCormick outspent Casey. That wasn't the case in the other states. I mean, spending does matter, and it has an impact, and we see it. And so there's also some unique dynamics, but I will give a shout out to your home state of Michigan, Halie, and the work that JDCA did in Michigan. Alyssa Slotkin ran a great campaign, and she really was able to, as an open seat, to really step in and define herself in a way that resonated in an incredibly difficult environment, especially in Michigan, where the economy has been difficult for people, or at least that's how they voters are telling us how hard it is for them, and where Rogers, her opponent, had some potential. So I think that combination of things is what really distinguished those Senate candidates and put us over the top in 4 of those states.
Thank you, Jim. We're getting a lot of comments on the chat. We will definitely get to some of the larger questions, but one in particular stood out. Well, a few have stood out for me. Someone asked about Angela Alsobrooks. As someone who lives in Maryland, thrilled with that win, as well as Lisa Blunt Rochester. To see 2 Black women in the Senate is wonderful. And the reason that we haven't mentioned them yet was because they won in states that Harris won. They didn't outperform the top of the ticket. That's what we were focused on until now. I would like to turn to the House. The House, the counting is still underway. The House majority has not officially been announced. Simon, if you could explain to us what is going on in terms of the House races, the House majority, and what we should expect in terms of the House.
Yeah, it's going to be it's going to be very close either way. It's more likely to be Republican than us at this point. It could very well be the exact same margin as last time. In theory, Trump will have greater ability to keep the Republicans together than Mike Johnson did last time. But, obviously them having the majority in the House is a big deal because it removes any ability for us to lead any kind of investigatory, investigations into Trump and malfeasance that is already happening with Elon Musk, already out of the box. And so, I think that it's a fascinating picture, right? Because we had incumbents lose that we didn't think we were going to lose. And I think we had some seats that we flipped that we weren't sure we were going to flip. I do think those of you in New York should realize that we have picked up, including Tom Suozzi's seat, we've picked up 4 seats in New York, flipped 4 seats. New York was kind of like the New Yorkers on here. You guys did a heavy lift, for us this year after having had a disappointing 2022 in the House. California, it could be again that California underperformed. And I think that one of the things, Halie, that we're all going to be grappling with is that, and I'm going to venture a little bit here and sort of, I'm getting potentially over my data skis here a little bit, but just to throw it out there that we've now had 2 elections in a row where in large Democratic states where there weren't competitive statewide races where we've had drop off and performance issues. In California now 2 in a row, New York, outside of these House races, there was some drop off, Illinois, New Jersey. And what I wrote about after 2022 was that, we did very well inside the battlegrounds where we ran our big campaigns, but outside the battlegrounds, we actually fell down. And we are going to have to really deal with this. I mean, Jim knows that the team that ran the Harris campaign were data nerds and, people that really stay very disciplined and on data and analytics. And the problem is that we didn't run a national campaign. We didn't ask all Democrats around the country to start voting early and to do national GOTV. Essentially, this was a campaign in 7 states and not in 50 states. And I know that it has to be, but we're now at a point where we have so much money, right? They spent $2 billion from August to election day. No one's ever had this kind of money before. The kind of volunteers we've had. They could have spent $25 million on national ads on CNN and MSNBC, touching Democrats all across the country, right? Like when we don't touch Democrats, the right-wing noise machine triumphs over us. And they have a structural information advantage every day that we can mitigate when we run our big campaigns. But where we don't run our big campaigns, what you're seeing is Democrats disengaging and dropping off. I mean, if we had 2020 levels of turnout in the big Democratic states, it's almost certainly that we would have won the national popular vote, which would have made this election very different, right? We may not have won the election, but him winning the national popular vote is a big deal for his sense of having, finally he really won, right? After not having won, or been won because of James Comey and not because of him. And so I think that one of the big things that has to happen with the chairs race and the new DNC is that we are living in a time of abundance now and not scarcity. And we have to change the way that we think about who the Democratic Party is, who our supporters are. I think we have 6 million donors. And all of you know that the only thing you ever heard from the campaign was more pleas asking you for money. And often they were telling you that we were losing the election when the polling was showing that we were winning the election. And instead of asking you to take their ads and share it through your networks or help us indict Trump and knock him out of the race, they could have had a relationship with all of you and all of us that was more respectful, treating us as partners in the fight, not donors to the cause, understanding that 6 million people are a vast information resource where we can, through our networks, reach millions and millions of more people. We were never asked to do that. All we were asked to do is to keep giving them money. And I think that the campaign made an enormous mistake in this regard, in that didn't understand and leverage in a networked and amplified age the resource that we all are. We're more than a financial resource, right? We have networks and we can spread information. And we're going to really need to rethink, I think, very fundamentally, the way that we understand what the Democratic Party is and who is the Democratic Party. It's not 450 people at the DNC or 200 people sitting in the headquarters. It's 6 million of us. And, we need to rethink and reimagine our understanding of all of this stuff. And I think all of us, I would just recommend to those of you who are donors, you have to demand from the party committees and from the DNC and the campaigns a higher level of respectful engagement in the future. And I think that they ate seed corn this time. They were too abusive to us, frankly, in the way that we were treated. We were lied to in their messages. And we have to be better than that, in my view, going forward. But that's a long answer, Halie.
Okay. Jim, now I'm responding to many of the things that have been put in the chat. Moving to the issues at hand in this election, can you describe the issues that were driving the Jewish vote and how they may have differed from the issues that were driving the rest of the electorate, and which issues you think ultimately were the top priorities that determined the outcome of the election at the presidential level?
Sure. As it relates to the Jewish vote, I mentioned at the outset that the two biggest issues driving people's vote were democracy and abortion rates. Now that's different than the general population, which wasn't citing democracy as their top issue. So I think when you look at Jewish voters, you have to look at them as a just very base Democratic constituency, and they have those priorities. They're not a swing constituency. They're not the one that they list, and they're certainly not a Republican constituency. They list immigration much lower on their list of priorities. They put that they're not Second Amendment rights people at all. And so there are some differences. There's some major differences, and you just have to look at the Jewish population as core Democratic-based constituency. I think and of course there is the Israel dynamic, and what that is, because there is this assumption that Israel is the top of the priority list, and Jews in America are very attached to Israel. They have strong emotional attachment. They express, close to 80% that they are emotionally attached to Israel. They care about Israel. It's important to them. The reason that it is not a determining voting issue for them, a determinative voting issue for them, is that they are looking for a candidate to be sufficiently supportive of Israel or credible on the issue of Israel. And once they pass that threshold of credibility, once a candidate passes that, Jewish voters move on to things that affect them on a more personal daily basis. And so all candidates, with the rare exception of a candidate here or there in a place where there are not Jewish voters, it very rarely fails to pass that threshold of credibility. Obviously, Kamala Harris far exceeded that threshold. Every Democratic and every Republican candidate for president has always passed this threshold. The statewide candidates do. It's not an issue when it comes to how Jews are going to vote. In the general population, what I would say, and one last thing about Israel as well. We also have lots of evidence in the JDCA polling and other polling that shows that Jews love Israel, support it, are attached to it, but don't take issue with criticism of Israeli government policy. They think, just as you can criticize American policy, it's okay to criticize Israeli government policy, and that doesn't make you anti-Israel. In fact, they think you can be both pro-Israel and critical of policy. Those things are not inconsistent. So it's an easy threshold to pass. As it relates to the general population, the issues, I think that there were a few different issues pulling voters in different directions. At the core, at the base of it, was this sense that wasn't consistent with macroeconomic data or anything like that, but this sense that inflation and the cost of living was too high, and that they placed that responsibility at the incumbent president's feet. That also happened at a time where they viewed the southern border as not secure, and that there was and they viewed Biden policy leading to an overflow of undocumented immigrants inside this country. I'm not making a judgment on the perceptions of those things. I'm just saying this was the perception, and that was pulling voters in one way, and they wanted change. And by the way, this change environment is true across the world, where incumbent parties are losing, or at least where voters are demanding change. You can look to England for the latest example. So it pulls in both ways, whether for the change from the right to the left or from the left to the right. It's pulling in multiple. The change is the underlying piece, and immigration and inflation is something that is an issue across the globe. Now, pulling in the other direction is this sense of abortion right, is the importance of abortion rights, as well as the sense that Trump is a threat to our country. And those things are in tension, and the country, as Simon underscored, is very evenly divided. And dealing with just a small number of voters shifting things one way or the other. And at the end of the day, and for those on this call who I was in touch with over the weekend before the election, it was the first time I had any sense of real optimism. I was during the course of the election was because I thought that voters were going to look at the last 2 weeks of this election, and those that were still deciding were going to say, he's more of the same, she's the one that's changed. But in the end, that's not what they concluded. I think they concluded that she was not going to be, they wanted change, and she was going to be, she was going to be a continuation of the current situation. So that, in terms of issues and dynamics, to me, that's what was intention. That's what at the end of the day broke things against us just by enough of the small number of people that deciding late that moved it from just a toss up to slight edge for Trump. And I understand I agree. The consequences, small differences can have huge consequences, both in terms of policy, in terms of our psyche. But I guess we'll talk about what comes next.
Haley, can I just jump in on one
Yes,
thing? I
please.
was reading the chat, which has been fun. And I want to just counsel everybody that one of the sort of memes that have come out is sort of this Dems beating themselves up over not understanding or fighting for working class people or rural people. And I just want to address that. I mean, Biden's entire presidency was about fighting for working class Americans. I mean, from lowering the getting the health insurance down to the lowest level that, the uninsured rate down to the lowest level that's ever been, the IRA, the infrastructure bills, all of this, the chips, all this stuff was geared towards people without college degrees, people in the trades. Biden was more pro-union than any president in American history. Biden walked a picket line. The economy, inflation was too high, but I posted this today on Hopium. I mean, real wages have been positive territory for 18 months. We have the best job market since the 1960s. I mean, Donald Trump is inheriting the best American economy in 60 years. And Joe Biden is the third consecutive Democratic president who has created very robust job growth, rising wages, lower deficits and the Republicans and the Republicans have led to 3 consecutive recessions and higher deficits. And I think that my advice to everyone here is this notion that our party doesn't do enough for working people is complete bullshit. And it's insulting to all of us who've been working, whether it's passing the ACA or moving the EITC or pushing the child tax credit, which the Republicans pulled back from us, or all the things that Biden has done. Since 1989, there have been 52 million jobs created in America. 50 million of them have come under Democratic presidents, all of them. And there's a lot of things you can say about us, but one of them is that we're not fighting every day for working people is not one of them. And it's, as somebody who's been working in Democratic politics at a policy and political level since 1992, I find it among the craziest things that I hear anybody say on our side, because it's as if they weren't really around during the last 32 years. And then the question becomes, as Jim pointed out, then why did we fall down? And why did we? And I do think that this issue, I'm also of the belief, and I'll throw this out there, that I think that the vice president could have run on, yes, inflation's too high, but also, we were handed a mess at the beginning of this administration and we made things a lot better for everybody, and inflation is too high. And we didn't do that. We spent the last several months of the election talking about how inflation is too high, which was also Donald Trump's argument against us. We were making his argument for him every day. And I know that the theory is we had to feel her pain, we had to feel everybody's pain and everything else. But the first rule of political communications is you don't repeat your opponent's attacks against you. And we spent a lot of money repeating one of his fundamental attacks against us throughout the election. And I believe, and this is Simon's belief, and not necessarily backed up by Jim's data, that there was a way to handle that. They wanted her to not be an incumbent, but she was. And they, instead of running away from the incumbency, which they sort of did, they needed to litigate the fact and make the case that they inherited a mess, they made things better, which is objectively true, by the way. It's also true. And I think I think they struggled with this. And I think this was in part something that, due to the compressed time frame, that was something that was really hard for them to figure out, because it was very nuanced and complicated. And I'm sure also people had strong feelings about this in the senior team. And I don't know that we nailed. I mean, look, if there were three things as an incumbent you have to do: disqualify your opponent, make the case for yourself, lay out your future agenda. We didn't do a very good job at number one and number two, in my view. And then finally, I also want to remind everybody that, this ticket is like the most middle class ticket in history. I mean, Kamala Harris came from nothing. I mean, Governor Walz came from nothing. They didn't go to Ivy League schools like the guys on the other side, right? And this, all these Republicans that we're looking at, they all went to Ivy League schools. Nancy Pelosi, our ticket, they're middle class kids. I mean, and I think we have to be very careful to not immediately run to this idea that, we haven't been out there fighting for everyday people, when that's been all that we've been doing for the last 32 years. And that we have to get to a sort of a deeper understanding of what happened here. And frankly, some of the power of the cultural issues that Trump, I mean, Halie, I'm going on too long here, but I want to remind everybody about one central fact about the Republican Party: that they've had one central domestic offering since the mid 1960s, and when they adopted the Southern strategy. When we embraced the civil rights movement, the party of racial reconciliation, the Republican Party, could have joined us in this. And they made a decision to do something else. They adopted the Southern strategy to take away the South. They abandoned their historic commitment to racial reconciliation and took on this Willie Horton, Donald Trump kind of view of politics. And it was a tragedy for the country. But the Republican Party for 60 years has been about one central thing domestically, which is exploitation of racial fear and demonization of the sociological other. And the economic stuff has been secondary. And why do we know that? Just go look at how we closed the election, right? And where their ads were. Their ads were about immigrants and trans and all this otherness stuff. It wasn't about the economy. And yes, having that become something that we incorporate into our understanding in a way in the center left, where we're comfortable talking about these things, when they can be uncomfortable. Race and all these issues can be very uncomfortable internally. But I do think, as some folks said, I mean, at the end of the day, she was a biracial woman. And if your closing argument was about those scary people that are not like us, which was an implicit way of talking about her, an inferred way of talking about her, an indirect way of talking about her, we can't look away at that stuff. As ugly as it is, it's still central to who they are.
Yes, and I've seen a lot of comments in the chat about the role that misogyny and racism played in this election, and there's no question, especially for women, the misogyny that we saw, including on the canvassing, it's quite painful. It's quite painful. There were a few husbands who slammed the doors in our faces in our attempt to speak with the woman in the House. We saw it. It's real. We have to overcome that as a society. It's going to take time, but we're not going to give up. In closing, I want to ask you both about what gives you hope from this election. I'll give you a minute to think about it and what messages you have for our community about the importance of this work going forward. But before I ask you that question, I do want to answer one question that I saw in the chat, and I'll take this one. And it has to do with the appointment of Governor Mike Huckabee to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. A few people have asked what we think about that. And it's actually illustrative of what we think of so far, all of these appointments that that Trump has made. He's utterly unqualified for this role. In the case of Mike Huckabee, he's an evangelical extremist. It reminds us of when Donald Trump moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and years later, perhaps out of anger toward Jewish Americans for not supporting him, he said he did it for the evangelicals. It appears that this appointment nomination is quite similar. Mike Huckabee is an extremist. His views regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are not aligned with what we consider to be in the national security interests of the United States. We don't think he will effectively be able to advance prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And it demonstrates that Donald Trump is just going to continue to determine his foreign policy, his domestic policy, these appointments by his own narrow self-interest. And we've made a statement about this appointment. We've made statements, we'll continue to make these statements, and we will, to the extent that there actually are confirmation hearings, and we hope there are, we hope the Senate doesn't abrogate its one responsibility when it comes to these confirmations, to actually have a vote and have hearings, we will oppose them. And we encourage you all to join us. But this is on brand for Donald Trump. He's quite reckless, and his views with regard to Israel have consistently been made based on his own political self-interest and political calculations. So that explains the Huckabee nomination. Turning to what gives you hope and the importance of this work going forward, Jim.
So what gives me hope is a couple of things, and not to mention hopium. And it's great to be on here with Simon, and I'm really happy that you talked about the Democrats standing up for the working class, because that has been something that the attacks on that have been infuriating. And I share your fury over it. What I would say, what gives me hope is two major things. One is we've been here before and we bounced back. And 2016 was a devastating blow. And 2 years later, we had come back, roaring back with the House majority and Senate majority, with House majority. And so I think that there is a pendulum here, that if we are able to dust ourselves off, get up and fight back, we have the opportunity to change things quickly. The other thing that gives me hope is related, and that is we have some pretty amazing emerging leadership in our party. I mean, truly amazing. I work closely with Hakeem Jeffries and his team, and they're outstanding. I mean, he is a really impressive leader, and I think we can take a lot of pride in his leading the Democratic House caucus and hopefully be Speaker in 2 years. We have some governors who are fabulous, who will provide very strong who can provide some national leadership. You know, people like Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro come to mind. Now we'll see how Josh Stein does in North Carolina. And I mean, I don't want to leave. There's plenty of outstanding Democratic governors out there that can speak up for us, or help lead. And as well as in the Senate, that we have some really impressive folks in the Senate, like Raphael Warnock and Chris Murphy and dozens of others. I mean, there's just a lot of great talent out there. I just threw out some names to get people to kind of hopefully inspire people and give hope. I'm sure people have there's a much longer list out there. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful. I don't want to sugarcoat it. We're all in a lot of pain and shock right now. But it is a very narrowly divided country. This House, it looks like we are going to net some gains in the House, despite the fact that redistricting took away one seat before we even started the election. When you look at the 3 from North Carolina, minus the 2 that we picked up in Alabama and Louisiana, this is a work in progress. And I think there are, as much pain we're in, we have no choice but to fight. And I think there are reasons to be hopeful that we can bounce back quickly.
Great. And Simon?
Yeah, I'll be brief, uncharacteristically brief. I really agree with how Jim ended about our emerging leaders. I mean, I was on James Carville's podcast a few months ago, and we talked about how the current crop of like the next crew is the best next crew we've ever had. And you can make your list, whatever it is. It's a powerful group. And I think that, what happens in a time of opposition, because we're in opposition, not resistance, in my view now, and a time where there won't be a single firm leader of the party for 4 years, these periods can often be very, a period of incredible reinvention and reimagination and renewal for a party. And I think it's important to approach this next phase with a spirit of, we got to learn from what didn't work, and we got to do new things and try new things and grow. I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is that, we didn't really have a traditional competitive primary for president in 2016. We didn't have one in 2024. 2022 was kind of an odd election because of COVID. And these kinds of presidential primaries that we're about to have with enormously talented people, which is, let's all be real, right? It's starting next week, right? The presidential primary thing, which team you're going to go get on. This period is going to be a period, I think, of advancement, renewal, modernization, or it can be. It certainly was in the Bush era when Bush had, I was very involved in efforts 20 years ago, and we did things like we figured out the millennial vote and the Hispanic vote, and we built new organizations like Center for American Progress and Media Matters, and it ended up being a period of reinvention and reimagination and building, and I think that that's what I hope this is going to be for us going forward, is that we have to, it's like an old house that needs updating, right? Like we gotta try new stuff. We gotta learn from the candidates like Alyssa Slotkin, who won in difficult circumstances. We have to understand their lessons. And I think in some ways, some of our modernization has been held back by us not having these competitive presidential primaries where ideas get debated, candidates emerge, right? New things happen. And so I think that what I would advise all of you, and particularly those of you who are investors in democratic politics, is that, look to invest in new capacities for us, new leaders, new capacities, not just play by the same old playbook, right, in the way that you give or engage, and stay involved here. I mean, this has been a great organization. It's got a great mission and a great group of people, but it's also focused and clear about what Halie and all of you are trying to do, right? And you've been successful, and that really matters too, also, right? In terms of going back to the things that do work and that we have to continue to build. I will say that, Halie, one of the things I challenge all of you to be thinking about is how, you can become louder, right? And take up more space, right, in the debate, using this resources you have. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for all of us now, is that we need to get louder. They're going to be very, very loud, and we need to get louder collectively and take up more space and be more competitive in the daily information environment. And I think we're ready to do that. I think like we're all ready to go fight. And I think finally, to echo what Jim said, it is the likely scenario is they overreach here and they give us real opportunities. In 2018, I was the senior advisor of the JDCA. It was the first election that, where we beat Trumpism and MAGA, and we won that election by 8.5 points. And, there was that midterm, and we ran a very strong and good committee. We all, I think, did a really good job, but we had to learn how to do that, right? Like we had to learn how to beat Trump and beat MAGA. And we did, and in part because they so dramatically overreached in their extremism and arrogance that they will give us opportunities, but we have to seize those opportunities. And so, part of I would also recommend is that you can't disengage. We got to stay in the game, and we got to fight it out. And our leaders are going to need support from us as they go fight these legislative battles in a very closely divided Congress, which is going to be far harder for them to manage. I think, even today, right? Thune became the Senate Majority Leader. MAGA's gone bananas. I mean, Elon Musk was like, we need Rick Scott, like they've already had like an internal fight that is causing enormous problems inside their thing just today, right? So, we got to stay in the game, and our democracy, our future, and our freedoms require that. And, I look forward, Haley, to doing, every few months I'll come back and we'll do a check-in. And Jim, it's been great to work with you. And I do whatever Bobby tells me. That's really what I do. But thank you all so much. And
Thank
thank you
you
for being
so
part of
much.
this amazing organization and for all that you did for all of us this cycle.
Thank you. And that is a great segue into concluding remarks from none other than Bobby Saferstein, our Chief Program Officer, who has put together so many wonderful programs over the past few months and will continue to do so. Bobby.
Thanks, Haley, and thanks, Simon and Jim, and each of you for joining today's conversation on the 2024 election, the Jewish vote, and what comes next. So, of course, while we wish we were gathering today under very different circumstances, it's critical that we don't lose sight of just how close this election actually was, and that we don't give up. As Vice President Harris reminded us last week, don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. As Haley stated at the outset, I want to join her in thanking everyone who made calls, who knocked on doors, and attended our many, many events. Over the next 4 years, Jewish voters will remain a vital part of the coalition that stands up for our values, and we hope you'll stay in this fight and get louder with JDCA. To learn more about all the ways you can join us, please visit jewishdems.org. We also hope you'll fill out a short survey we just shared in the chat so we can learn more about you, the issues you care about, and how you want to partner with us as we move forward. Finally, if you've enjoyed our programs and events, we hope you'll consider investing in JDCA so we can continue to grow, take up more space, and be even stronger in 2025. You can make a contribution by clicking on the link in the chat. There's no question that what's ahead is going to be challenging, but let's not forget who we are and the Jewish and democratic values that guide us. So, after you take a moment to catch your breath, the fight continues. We're not going anywhere. We're just getting started. Thank you for joining JDCA. We look forward to seeing you again soon.